Well, good evening, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and this is my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And well, it's nice to turn on the show and see the chat room. And wow, TiVo got my Kindle McDuff Lives. Thank you, TiVo. I certainly hope you enjoy it and find it meaningful. I do very much appreciate it when folks go ahead and get the Kindle version. And we're well, I was just talking to Andy about getting set up to print some. I really hope that it turns out to be the Neighborhood News Studio publishing house that does the printing. We're right now absolutely deferring to George Webb and getting his books out as fast as they can. That's the project of the hour, and I advise everyone to just keep supporting George's work while he goes through some of the really toughest battles of his campaign right now. So stick with him. He's been the vanguard. He's the guy. He's the man, and he's the man with the plan. So definitely appreciate your supporting my book, and I really want everybody to read it. Just share it, print out 100 copies and hand them out at your office or something. I mean, I really think that we can solve this thing if people pay attention to what happened to McDuff when McDuff just tried to do the right thing. And that's not a unique story in this country. We're finding that happening right and left, where people are simply trying to help understand what's going on, and bad things happen. Bad things do happen. And tonight I want to talk about some of the book. I'm reading 3 or 4 books at once now. I think maybe 4 right now. Still not done with this fabulous book, Trading with the Enemy. Sorry about that. There. Trading with the Enemy by Charles Higham. It's got to go on the book train at screamingospreys.com. The Standard Oil Company, which of course is Rockefeller's, right, is interlocking boards of directors with the IG Farben. And that's the Nazi business. So people just don't want to know this or don't want to talk about it. But my God, there's a copy of it. But yeah, you got to take this seriously. This is General Motors, this is DuPont, this is IT&T, this is BASF, that conglomerate of Nazi things, that Nazi companies that had to do with film and chemicals and all kinds of monopolies and trade secrets and things that were just given in many cases to the Nazis because of this philosophy that this author calls uh, business as usual, and that these people from Hjalmar Schacht's financial ideas in Nazi Germany to the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan and the DuPonts all belong to this thing that he calls the fraternity, in which they say, well, we're doing business. Maybe there's a war on, but that does not mean that we don't have to fulfill our contracts. And that's how the war happened. I mean, my God, if they had not sold the that particular leaded fuel from Standard Oil to the Nazis, then the Nazi Stuka bombers could not have flown. They could not have devastated Poland. They could not have, they just couldn't get off the ground. And people at the top of these big corporations, especially the Rockefellers, had the power to just say no, if we let you have this fuel, then you're going to use it to kill American boys. But they didn't say no. They said business as usual. Did they tell you that in high school history? I don't think so. They didn't tell me that. Matter of fact, the corporations that are doing it are now taking over the education system. And I think, we all should thank James Corbett for his great work on the Rockefeller education uh, monopolies and the distortion of true education into simple training programs and um, compliance, which is what we're stuck with now. This ridiculous excuse for education, which is doesn't doesn't teach. Education is supposed to teach you how to think, not what to think. So this is all happening under this incredibly wealthy group of men called the fraternity, whether they're German or British or Dutch or American, Spanish, Italian. It doesn't matter because they all have the same philosophy called business as usual. And that means we get screwed every time. So, again, looking at a particular aspect of the Rockefeller family that I had not really known. And I think I owe a debt to these authors, Gerard Colby and Charlotte Dennett, who wrote this tome here called Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller and Evangelism in the Age of Oil. Now, the book itself, published in, let's see, published in 1995 by Gerard Colby with Charlotte Dennett. I think that's his wife. And she is the author of a more recent book and she's a friend of Andy Craig, who we had lunch with yesterday to celebrate Drummer's birthday. We went down to the Old Ebbitt Grill, the famous watering hole and eating establishment down by Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. We had a wonderful time catching up with Andy Craig and listening to his regaling us with stories from the Washington Press Corps and all kinds of interesting intrigues that he's been part of over the years. A great author, a great friend, the author of Presidential Puppetry, which reveals a tremendous amount of CIA influence on all the presidents since, well, the first one he started with, I think, was wasn't Carter. It was it was Bush the first. Yeah. So just to introduce the book, here's a in the frontispiece by Norman Lewis in the Sunday Times of London, February 1969, quote, by the descriptions of all who had seen them, there were no more inoffensive and charming human beings on the planet than the forest Indians of Brazil. And brusquely we were told they had been rushed to the verge of extinction. The tragedy of the Indian in the United States in the last century was being repeated, but it was being compressed into a shorter time. The official report said pioneers leagued with corrupt politicians had continually usurped Indian lands, destroyed whole tribes, in which bacteriological warfare had been employed, by issuing clothing impregnated with the virus of smallpox and by poisoned food supplies. Children had been abducted and mass murder gone unpunished. The government itself was blamed to some extent for the Indian Protection Service's increasing starvation of resources over a period of 30 years. The service had also had to face, quote, the disastrous impact of missionary activity. Introduction of the book is I think I'll read a good bit of it. The dark, comforting silence of the confessional shattered as the tiny sliding door rapped open, spraying light into through a small screen. Yes, my son, encouraged the priest, when the male voice, whispering, faltered. Then, out of the shadows it came, a torrent of crimes so overpowering that Father Edgar Smith's vow of silence shook to its Jesuit foundations. Murder, the man explained, mass murder had been committed, and he, Ataide Pereira, had taken part. He could no longer live with his conscience. Besides, he had not been paid the $15 he had been promised. The victims were Cintas Largas, a small Indian tribe in the Brazilian Amazon. Named for the broad belts of bark that were their only clothing, this group of 400 souls had lived for centuries along the Arapana River, hunting and fishing with arrows dipped in curare, successfully resisting all intruders. But now Brazilian and foreign companies coveted their lands. The Indians were marked for removal. Since Brazilian law technically protected the Indians as wards of the state, only surreptitious violence could be used. It was a common enough solution. The general overseer of a local rubber company, Francisco de Brito, had already earned the local title of champion Indian killer by taking any Indians he captured on a quote visit to the dentist. The victim was forced to open wide and shot through the mouth with a pistol. But one band of Cintas Largas had eluded the final solution by living deep in the jungle. Fortunately for De Brito, a man was found who knew enough of the culture of the Cintas Largas to tell him the precise day when most of the people of this village were likely to gather. The occasion would be deceptively joyful, their annual family reunion. The Indians would gather in the center of the village to pray, feast, and consult ancestral spirits represented by masquerading dancers. De Brito concluded that the ceremony would be the perfect target for an aerial bombing. He hired a pilot and a commercial Cessna that flew over the village on the holy day, dropping sugar on the first pass and dynamite on the second. To hunt down the survivors seen fleeing into the jungle, De Brito turned to his underling, Chico, a man with a fondness for the machete. Pereira was one of Chico's recruits. We went by launch up the Wanera River, Pereira said. There were 6 of us, men of experience, commanded by Chico, who used to shove his Tommy gun in your direction whenever he gave you an order. The men hacked their way through the jungle, fighting hordes of insects, enduring heat and downpours. We were handpicked for the job, as quiet as any Indian party when it came to slipping in and out of trees. As we spotted their village, we made a stop for the night. We got up before dawn, then we dragged ourselves yard by yard through the underbush until we were within range, and after that we waited for the sun to come up. Well, I can't really even read the rest of it because it's all about what they did to the villagers and the children in particular, and I'm not going to subject you or myself to this horrific story any longer. But to continue back into the confessional with Father Smith, listening to the man's confession, Father Smith kept his head. Using all the powers of absolution at his command, he prevailed on Pereira to repeat his story on tape. Quote, I want to say now that personally I've nothing against the Indians, Pereira claimed, but the Indians' lands were rich in gold, diamonds, and rare minerals. Quote, the fact is, the Indians are sitting on valuable land and doing nothing with it. They've got a way of finding the best plantation land, and there's all these valuable minerals about it, too. They have to be persuaded to go, and if all else fails, well, then it has to be force. Father Smith turned over the tape to local authorities, demanding an investigation, but for years the 1963 massacre of the Cintas Largus was covered up. Three prosecutors had withdrawn from the case, claiming conflicts of interest. Only when a congressional outcry over the growing sales of Amazonian lands to foreign companies prompted revelations in 1968 by the Interior Minister of widespread Indian genocide did the Attorney General press for a trial. More than $62 million of Indian property had been stolen in the previous decade, and at least 1,000 crimes, ranging from embezzlement to murder, were laid at the doorstep of the government's world-acclaimed Indian Agency, the Service for the Protection of the Indian, SPI. The evidence of genocide was overwhelming. 20 volumes of evidence had been collected, determining the destruction of whole tribes, attacks by outsiders using everything from poisoned food to clothing infected with smallpox had resulted in Indian deaths by the tens of thousands. Anthropologists' estimates of the Indian population in Brazil ranged from just below 100,000 to a high of 200,000 in 1957. By 1968, these estimates had been cut by 50%. Anywhere from 40,000 to as many as 100,000 men, women, and children had died. The Indians north of the Amazon River had suffered particularly after 1964, when a military coup overthrew the elected government. Now, nationalist army officers led by General Albuquerque Lima wanted the Holocaust stopped, along with the foreign corporate penetration of the Amazon that they claimed had fanned the flames. By then, however, most of the witnesses of the Cintas Largus massacre, as well as Father Smith, either had disappeared or were dead. The archives of the SPI had been destroyed in a mysterious fire. Finally, guns and tanks intervened. A military coup in 1968, the second in 4 years, deposed the Nationalist Attorney General and the Interior Minister. None of the 134 SPI officials charged with crimes would ever stand trial. The head of SIL's branch in Brazil disclaimed all reports of genocide, and the founder of it, William Cameron Townsend, denied any knowledge of the massacres at all. A little over a year later, the International Police Academy, a school in Washington, sponsored by the Agency for International Development, AID, but actually run by the CIA, would report that a new Indian Guard was being trained in Brazil. The Indian Guard, modeled after the tribal police of the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, was placed under the authority of the regime's hurried replacement for the disgraced SPI, the National Foundation for the Indian, known as FUNAI. FUNAI, in turn, was placed under the command of the former Chief of Military Intelligence. It would take another 2 years before a top FUMI agent would reveal that the Indian Guard was rounding up resisting Indians for a, quote, re-education at a concentration camp at Krenaque in the mining state of Minas Gerais. Quote, I am tired of being a gravedigger of the Indians, the agent stated in resigning from FUNAI. I do not intend to contribute to enrichment of economic groups at the cost of the extinction of primitive cultures. By then, FUNAI had adopted the BIA's policy of leasing Indian lands to mining companies. While its military superiors in the Interior Ministry in Brasilia were cooperating with the U.S. Geological Survey in an AID-sponsored aerial survey of the Amazon. Among the American companies that would be allowed to enter the Cintas Largus Reservation to explore for cassiterite, 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 a vital component in tin production, was a firm partly controlled by a friend of Nelson Rockefeller. In June of 1969, a huge silver jet bearing the words "The United States of America" descended toward the airport of Brasilia, the nation's futuristic capital in the Amazon basin. As the airliner's shadow passed over the shining steel and glass buildings that symbolized Brazil's pledge to conquer its wild interior, thousands of soldiers surrounded the ultra modern airport and lined the streets. Air Force Two landed with a screech and rolled toward the crowd of dignitaries waiting near the terminal. A door swung out, and a man, his familiar square jaw cradling a wide smile, stepped briskly down the ramp. Nelson Rockefeller had arrived. So, this is the facts. This is the genocide of the Indians of South America, preceded by the genocide mostly of the Indians of the United States. And when I say genocide, I guess I don't mean, 100% executed, but I still think that the word applies when, even if it's a small tribe, the tribe is wiped out. So I have a few more passages from this book that I wanted to bring to your attention. Because I had no idea how religious the Rockefellers were. But when you listen to what I'm going to read to you, you'll see how it sounds just like what happened with the Dulles brothers. Okay, we're going to start here on page 11. The religious Rockefellers. And this is where the stuff that I didn't really know about what they call the Northern Baptists, the Northern Baptists, is very, very Calvinist, just like the Presbyterians. So the religious Rockefellers. Nelson's father had been raised within the moral confines of the Northern Baptist Church. Everything in life was severely measured, everything reduced to its place within the safe clockwork universe of a Newtonian God. Pocantico, grandfather's 3,600-acre estate overlooking the Hudson River, symbolized this passion for order. Surrounded by tall fences and guarded gates, Pocantico was a world apart, isolated from the chaos of nature. Isolated from the chaos of nature. Doesn't that tell you a lot? It's like they want us to take these pharmaceutical solutions because nature is not going to, we don't trust nature anymore. So we're going to rely on, you know, pharmaceuticals, right? So anyway, I think that this book has a tremendous amount of good writing and resonance to it. I'm going to enjoy reading the rest of it. Formal gardens, acres of flower beds and carefully manicured lawns and shrubs and transplanted trees positioned at strategic points along paved roads all spoke of the steely will of the Calvinist ex-bookkeeper who had founded Standard Oil. On top of the tallest hill stood the huge stone chateau Junior had built for his father in atonement for the wooden mansion that he had accidentally burned down during one of his summer stays there. Beneath grandfather's mansion, cradled in the valley below, Junior built his own home, its modest size, appropriate to his station in the family's patriarchy. Here, under the long shadow of their grandparents' frillless religion, Nelson and his brothers and sister were raised, each morning precisely at 7:45 a.m. Junior would lead them in prayer and Bible readings around the breakfast table. Each evening before dinner, they would pray again. Between Junior's exhortations on the importance of keeping accurate accounts of their allowances and the occasional reward for killing flies at a penny apiece, the children were drilled in Bible verses written on cardboard file cards. Sunday evenings, after the obligatory state dinner with grandfather on the hill, were often given over to singing hymns. Nelson, the most effusive of the children, suffered terribly. "We sang hymns tonight," he once wrote to his mother, Abby Rockefeller, after one such night when she could not attend. "But luckily, Pa had to go to church, so we stopped at 7:45." Junior was not simply a church goer, he was a church leader. For years, he ran a Bible class for aspiring young men at the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church in New York City. He was a heavy contributor to the Northern Baptist Convention and its missions. He also gave millions to the Young Men's Christian Association. It was at a YMCA meeting at Brown University, in fact, that Junior delivered a famous address comparing the elimination of small business competitors to the pruning that made the American beauty rose possible. All right, there's another speed bump. Let's listen to that little part again. Junior delivered a famous address comparing the elimination of small business competitors to the pruning that made the American beauty rose possible. Isn't it interesting now that metaphor? First of all, the idea of the rose, pruning the rose, is people like Angleton and some of the others were rose aficionados. They grew roses, and they had the spray and the pruning shears and everything. They're trying to make champion roses, and isn't it interesting to think of that as a metaphor in their lives? And my grandfather, I mean, my Uncle John, my father's Uncle John, who I've told you a lot about, was a avid gardener of roses. So these guys have something about, and then of course Rosicrucian. Whether that's a connection, I think it probably is. Anyway, the elimination of small business competitors. What the heck do you think they're doing right now? What is this lockdown really all about? It's elimination of small business. It's putting everything into the hands of these big corporations that already own 80, 90% of everything. It's just another shakedown of small businesses. And why? Because that is pruning our economy. Because, everybody knows these small businesses are wasteful, right? Need to get some productivity going. Yeah. Well, that that's what happens when I read these passages and I say, wow, I can't go past that. I got to make a comment. It's what I call my speed bumps. In page 26 now, just skipping ahead a little. In the spring of 1926, Junior is JDR the second, or they call him Junior, right? He's Nelson's father. In the spring of 1926, Junior was preparing for his third trip west in 6 years when he received a letter from Wolf Plume, the Blackfoot leader, and Black Bull, another elder. Quote, "We are extremely under hard circumstances as we go without eating for 3 or 4 days at times. We hope you will be able to see your way clear to aid us this spring." Unquote. Junior was on the fence. The Indians' circumstances again forced him to contend with old Rockefeller traditions. He did not want to answer the letter, but his silence could be taken as insensitive by a number of people, foremost among them his sons. The Indians struck the tender chord themselves in this letter. "How would you feel," they asked, quote, "if you were in our state of circumstances?" Then they moved in on Junior's soft spot. Quote, "Wolf Plume wants to know how your little son, Lawrence, is getting along, whom Wolf Plume christened." Typed on the stationery of the Indian Protective Association of Montana, the letter indicated that influential whites as well as Indians were waiting to see how Rockefeller responded, if at all. Since his children were involved, Junior also had to consider the feelings of their mother. Abby was a conspirator of sorts with the children against Junior's Baptist authoritarianism and bristled at anything hinting of racial discrimination. Quote, "Put yourself in the place of an honest poor man who happens to belong to one of the so-called despised races," she wrote to Nelson. Junior thought it might be wise to make inquiries. He passed Wolf Plume's letter on to the BIA. Fearing more requests for aid, Junior suggested that something should be done to, quote, "strike more at the root of the matter." The response was defensive, rooted as always in the Calvinist notion of self-sufficiency. Quote, "Where the Indians have invested in sheep on the reimbursable plan, they are getting along very nicely. If these Indians will get down to business and help themselves just a little, they can get along all right." Unquote. Another response to the inquiries was less quieting. One of his guides in 1924 confirmed that Wolf Plume's band, quote, "is in a worse way now than for some time past and may be going hungry part of the time." But the problem was the Indians themselves and their culture. Quote, "The band you saw are all full bloods, all related, or mostly so, and that's the reason Wolf Plume and Big Spring may be hard up now, because they have shared with the others. Your old full blood will always share with his people." Unquote. The selfish individualism that accompanied property ownership had not taken root with the older Indians. He advised the Rockefellers not to send money to these, quote, "simple-minded children," unquote. He pledged to admonish them not to write you in this way again. It was, quote, "the government's place and duty to look after these people and not you," unquote. Junior agreed. There is no record that Junior ever answered Wolf Plume's letter. The extent of investments in the Bible translation business by the Rockefellers, and especially by Nelson Rockefeller, is just astounding. He figured out a way to use the missionaries to open up avenues into the Indian cultures, and the story is just it's difficult. It's very difficult. The way that they would figure out a way to uh, worm their way in the Indian souls, I guess, according to the missionaries, the Indian souls were getting saved um, as they were dying, and perhaps that's a good thing for somebody. But I don't think it was what the Indians really wanted. I didn't think they were too worried about their souls. They seemed to have been pretty content, except for they were so content that they looked a little bit lazy to the Calvinists. And why would you let those lazy people sit on top of a gold mine or a silver mine or some rare metals that you could use to make sophisticated technological equipment for whatever purpose, whether it be peaceful or war? It's the story, there's so many versions of this story that go back a long ways. And when George and I met together up at National Harbor, which is in Oxon Hill, Maryland, we were there in the old Oxon Hill Manor area, the land of the Addison family. And the original John Addison, the first of the Addisons, there was, I think, 4 or 5 of them by the time the, the place was finally, uh, sold off. But the original John Addison was an Indian killer, an Indian feared by the Indians. And the village called Anacostia on the Anacostia River, which is in Washington, D.C., was an Indian village. And it is that particular Indian village that was attacked with smallpox blankets by, the history tells us, by Colonel John Addison. Were those Indians a threat to him? I doubt it. I think he just coveted the space, the land. That's old English action against the Indians here in Maryland. And it's the same thing that you hear going on in other places, in other parts of the world. Of course, the British, when they attacked um, Canada, uh, they spread smallpox by various means, including unfortunate women that were infected with it and then sent out as, camp followers. And it said that the Americans that went to attack were more wiped out by smallpox than by the French. So the use of smallpox and the use of biological warfare is an old thing, and it is definitely associated with the Anglo-Saxons. And now the Americans that are the elites of Wall Street. And to speak of fellow human beings as mere children that need to be admonished for even asking for help, that's a Calvinist attitude that is a characteristic of the wealth class of this country that I think is very much part of what we should be reflecting upon. It's not just simple greed. It is a mental attitude of I'm doing God's work, even though I'm committing genocide. How can that be any different from what the Nazis were doing when they wore a belt buckle that said Gott mit uns? God's with us. They're not just joking around. They really believe this stuff. And that's the Wall Street attitude that we're facing right now. That all of these people are just too many people. They're all in the way. Remember when we were invaded Iraq, and people were saying, how did our oil get under their sand? How is it possible that our oil could have been left there under the sand of these Arabs? That's supposed to be ours. So let's go get it. The authors tell about the reaction of various Indian groups in the United States and elsewhere, Mexico in particular, which would rise up in desperation and say, no, I mean, I won't live this way. I will fight for my people even into the death. And part of that is reflected in the episode of Rockefeller Sinners engagement of the artist Diego Rivera to create a mural at the grand entrance of Rockefeller Center. It seems that Rockefeller Center was built in the Depression, and there wasn't any interest in renting there. And so Nelson Rockefeller, having been in charge of the project, is trying to figure out how to get tenants. So he says, "Well, let's get some art. Let's get his big artwork." That was his solution. And so they got in touch with Diego Rivera, who was already famous for creating these big, colorful murals in other federal and American buildings. Let's see, what was it in San Francisco, I think. So Nelson Rockefeller, a fan of modern art, takes on a project. I'll just read about it. Nelson did not come up with the idea of a Rivera mural for the center. That suggestion came from a representative of the Rockefeller Foundation in Mexico, Mrs. Frances Flynn Payne. That's an interesting name, isn't it? Paine. Through Payne's influence, Rivera had been commissioned to paint the murals in the San Francisco Stock Exchange and Henry Ford's Detroit Technical Institute. Impressed by the power of his work, Payne recommended Rivera to Abbey, sure that his murals would conform to the orthodox version of American history and, quote, progress as accelerated by the discovery and large use of petroleum, unquote. Junior, as usual, objected futilely. Backed by his mother, Nelson prevailed. Abbey was intrigued by Rivera. High-spirited and possessed of a streak of bohemianism, Abby had little trouble asserting her independence from her husband when it came to art. Nelson had reasons beyond art for selecting Rivera, business reasons. Diego Rivera represented exactly the kind of mix of controversy and quality that the new Rockefeller Center needed to draw crowds of tourists. As soon as Rivera arrived in March 1933, a furor of speculation erupted over what he was going to paint. Day after day, Nelson would pass by the painter's tall scaffolds in the center's lobby and crane his neck to watch Rivera's assistants sketch the outline of a great scene across 63 feet of wall, 17 feet high. At first, it was difficult to make out the shapes, but contrary to his later claims, Nelson knew most of what would appear. In November, Abbey had approved Rivera's sketch for the mural and its accompanying synopsis. The mural was to be, quote, a salute to science, with Jupiter capturing lightning as a source of electricity and the, quote, man of science, presenting the scale of natural evolution, the understanding of which replaces the superstition of the past. It was also to present a vivid political portrayal of tyranny, war, and rebellion by the laboring classes. Quote, my panel will show the workers arriving at a true understanding of their rights regarding the means of production, Rivera wrote to Abbey. It will also show the workers of the cities and the country inheriting the earth. On the left, a group of unemployed workers in a breadline. Above this group, an image of war, as in the case of unemployment, the result of the evolution of technical power unaccompanied by a corresponding ethical element. The Rockefellers, of course, had another less concrete vision. Our theme is new frontiers, they wrote. Man cannot pass up his pressing and vital problems by moving on. He has to solve them on his own lot. The development of civilization is no longer lateral, it is inward and upward. It is the culmination of man's soul and mind and coming into a fuller comprehension of the meaning and mystery of life. It was in many ways a statement reflecting its time. The Great Depression was viewed as the punishment of an angry God against a decade of hedonism. Reform, personal and national, was now the order of the day. Skipping ahead, after a few days of self restraint, he could bear it. De Rivera could bear it no longer. Suddenly, the giant wall sprang alive with colors and sweeping shapes, causing a sensation in New York's art world. Hundreds of artists and students came to watch the Mexican paint his great allegory of the World War and the Roaring Twenties. Nelson, never one to let an opportunity for promotion pass, issued about 100 tickets a day. One day in April, Abby came by and climbed up the metal scaffold to watch the artist work. She was enthralled. Whatever Nelson's initial feelings, his opinion changed after an article appeared on May 3rd in the New York World Telegram under the headline, Rivera paints scenes of communist activity and John D. Jr. foots the bill. The telegram attacked the mural for vividly depicting, quote, poison gases used in war and prostitutes infected with venereal diseases, so placed as to indicate them as the results of a civilization revolving around nightclubs, unquote. The reporter saw red everywhere, red headdress, red flags, waves of red, an iron jawed policeman, one swinging his club at what a reporter described as a communist demonstration. The article created the impression that the Rockefellers had been duped. Nelson responded to Rivera. He wrote Rivera that while visiting Rockefeller Center yesterday, the progress of your thrilling mural, I noticed the most recent portion of the painting you had included a portrait of Lenin. The piece is beautifully painted, but it seems to me that his portrait appearing in the mural might very seriously offend a great many people. Nelson asked him to substitute the face of some unknown man where Lenin's face now appears. A figure of Lenin had been included in Rivera's earliest sketches. Nelson's sudden turnabout convinced the artist that something terrible was afoot. His response was to work at a frenzied pace. He wanted to finish his painting before it could be aborted. He offered to add a portrait of Lincoln surrounded by abolitionists and the slave revolutionary Nat Turner. But he would not destroy any part of his painting, including the portrait of Lenin. It had been there for a month without any previous objection by Nelson or his mother and represented to the artist a prophecy of an anti Nazi alliance between Russians and Americans. Think about that. This is in 1933, and the 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 Nazis have just come into power, but come into power with the support of the Rockefellers, right? So now you've got Diego Rivera trying to press the case of the oppressed workers and the victims of war and poison gases and intentionally spread venereal diseases. Where have we heard this before? So he's there trying to set a tone of America working with Russia to forestall and stop the Nazi expanse and prevent the Holocaust. But Nelson Rockefeller is on the other side of that. He's like, no, we don't want to be allies with the communists. So A week later, matters were taken out of Nelson's hands. Rivera received a letter from Hugh Robertson, executive manager of the center, insisting that there had been not the slightest inclination either in the description, not the slightest indication in the description or the sketch that you would include in the mural any portrait on any subject matter of a controversial matter. At 9 p.m. the next night, a messenger scurried up the scaffold with a smug smile and summoned Rivera, still working, to Robertson's office. There, Rivera was handed a check for $21,500, the contract price, and ordered to leave. Almost a year later, at the lonely hour of midnight, February 9th, 1934, workers appeared under orders to chip the painting off the wall. In its place, a politically safer mural in sepia was done by Jose Maria Sert. This time, it was Robertson who did the hiring. Now, I'm going to skip forward to page 265 of the book for the last couple of minutes of the show to bring in, and this is in the 50s, of course, Nelson Rockefeller as President Eisenhower's advisor on the Cold War and, in particular, psychological warfare, because this is another avenue in which we can investigate the MK Ultra program, which I think was definitely involved in my father's demise. To the general public, Nelson's new job as special assistant to the president for Cold War affairs was shadowy. Newsweek editors who when told what he was about to attend the cabinet, the National Security Council, the Council on Foreign Economic Policy, and the Operations Coordinating Board, came closest to the truth by describing Nelson as Ike's Cold War general. The president's press secretary, James Haggerty, would admit only that Nelson's task would be much broader than Jackson's had been. Nelson would add to that job consideration of how to coordinate work of all government agencies toward the president's program for peace, unquote. Dulles, Burrell noted in his diary, had asked Nelson to take the new job because he's on the defensive everywhere. He feels something is lacking and expects Nelson to supply the miraculous element. The Third World, Burrell is one of the economic advisors to Roosevelt, who facilitated the Lend-Lease program and was working with the Soviets, by the way. Anyway, more about Burrell on another show. We're kind of running out of time, so let me just bring in this. This is so amazing and important. It's still in the face of this reality. Burrell and Rockefeller could believe that the problem Allen Dulles was having with the Third World was fundamentally philosophical. Nelson felt, and quote, I cordially stimulated that the real trouble here was philosophical and spiritual more than economic, material, and political. There's no guideline to any political policy. Another dimension was needed, unquote. With Nelson taking on the role of Cold War advisor, a new dimension did develop, but its thrust was decidedly more political than philosophical and spiritual. Its goal was control over all covert operations abroad, with Nelson in the cockpit. Where have we heard control of all covert operations abroad? Well, that was Sachs's job 20 years later, wasn't it? So Nelson Rockefeller, the chair of the special group of the National Security Council, becomes the overseer of the CIA's expansion of its MK Ultra mind control experiments. Nelson needed little introduction to MK Ultra. The CIA's use of HEW for mind control experiments had been initiated during his tenure as Undersecretary, that's Health, Education, and Welfare. The Rockefeller Foundation was also no stranger to this field of research. In 1943, it had set up the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal. That's right, where George Webb went to investigate Ewan Cameron's creepy experiments. The Institute's articles attracted the attention of the Pentagon and the CIA, and Pentagon grants for research on brainwashing grew steadily. It was not long before Adolf Berle agreed to serve on the board of the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, a foundation the CIA created as a cover for MK Ultra. I am frightened about this one, Berle wrote in his diary. If the scientists do what they have laid out for themselves, men will become manageable ants. But I don't think it's going to happen. There were eminent physicians and scientists on the board of the society, but lurking around the sterile formal reports of the researchers was violence. Unaware of their being guinea pigs for the CIA, patients were given a sleep cocktail of 100 milligrams of thorazine, 100 milligrams of nembutal, 100 milligrams seconal, 150 milligrams veronal, and 10 milligrams of phenergan, and then subjected to 150 volts of electroshock for periods 20 to 90 times longer than normally applied by physicians, 2 to 3 times a day for 15 to 30 days, and sometimes as long as 65 days. The CIA was interested in creating a blank mind that could be reprogrammed. The Rockefeller Foundation funded the sensory deprivation research. The technique involves strapping people in a large box and cutting them off from light, sound, smells, or touching. In 1955, HEW's National Institutes of Health, yes, the National Institutes of Health, same people, began CIA funded experiments using the standard technique minus the practice of freeing subjects when they wanted to be freed. Soon, mind control experiments spread throughout the country, nurtured by funding directed by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the chemical division of the CIA Technical Services staff, and, according to one former CIA officer, part of the old boy network in the CIA that included Nelson Rockefeller's former CIA associate in Brazil, J.C. King, now CIA chief of clandestine activities in the Western Hemisphere. In May 1955, the CIA received a startling proposal to, quote, provide for agency-sponsored research involving covert biological and chemical warfare. Dr. Charles Geschichter asked the CIA to contribute $375,000 toward the construction of a special cancer research building at Georgetown University Hospital. He promised a, quote, hospital safe house with 1/6 of the building's beds dedicated to the CIA, complete with cover for 3 CIA scientists and, quote, human patients and volunteers for experimental use, unquote, including the severely mentally retarded and terminal cancer patients. Allen Dulles approved, but the CIA money passed through private channels would allow Geschichter to get matching funds from HEW for the hospital's construction. The use of private funds to pass on government CIA money so HEW's matching grant requirements could be met would mean deliberate misleading of at least one other executive department of the U.S. government, the HEW, and probably the Treasury Department's IRS as well. Dulles decided to get higher approval. He knew just the man. Nelson Rockefeller, as chairman of the special group, listened attentively as Dulles laid out his case for the MK Ultra Hospital. His only question was whether Geschichter could offer a reasonable expectation that the CIA scientists would have the space he promised. Given Dulles' assurance, Nelson gave his approval. During Nelson's chairmanship of the special group, the CIA also searched for some means to program assassins. The CIA had discovered that a man, quote, could be surreptitiously drugged through the medium of an alcoholic cocktail at a social party, and the subject induced to perform the act of attempting assassination of an official in a government in which he was, quote, well established socially and politically. The CIA officer in charge of security for the operation was Sheffield Edwards. Edwards later worked under Edward Lansdale in Operation Mongoose, the assassination attempts against Cuba's Fidel Castro. Well, as you can tell, I didn't want to wrap the show up without finishing that little part of the book, Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller and Evangelism in the Age of Oil by Gerald Colby with Charlotte Dennett. And you see, now we have a whole new avenue of exploration from the fundamental Baptist philosophy of Calvinism to the desire to control men's minds using chemicals, MK Ultra, LSD, and the connections here in Georgetown and with the facilities here in the Washington area make it clear that the CIA was definitely ready, willing, and able to surreptitiously poison people, destroy their minds in an attempt to control them for the purposes of which the CIA exists. Well, I could go on, but let's call it a night. Tomorrow, Thursday night, the great TNT Thursday night trio with George Webb, Professor Hamamoto. I'm looking forward to it. And thanks again for being with us tonight here at McDuff Lives. Good night.